Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the archetype of the Puer Aeternus. Alright, so this video is all about the archetype of the Puer Aeternus and how to integrate that archetype. And the Puer Aeternus basically means eternal child. And recently, Dr. K from the YouTube channel Healthy Gamer has gone into several different videos about this archetype, and so I figured I would also throw my 2 cents in on this. Now, before we get further into the video, one thing that's really important to be able to distinguish between is the Puer Aeternus archetype, which is an archetype that we all have, and the Puer Aeternus in the sense that it is often used, which when we call someone a Puer or a Puella, it kind of means that they're sort of an adult, is stuck in extended adolescence or extended childhood. And truly, when someone is a Puer or a Puella, it means that the Puer Aeternus archetype has become too dominant within the psyche and that has basically started to choke out other potentials. So what we're aiming to do in this video is to understand the archetype and how to integrate it properly without it having this possessive role, but also without repressing it, because there's nothing wrong with the Puer Aeternus archetype itself. It's just that when it takes this possessive role in our psyche, it creates a lot of problems, just like any archetype that takes a possessive role in the psyche. Now, a few things that I want to define first. So first off, what is an archetype? Well, an archetype basically is a common blueprint of meaning that is innate to every single person. And so when Carl Jung came up with the idea of the archetypes, he was talking about the collective unconscious, which is the consciousness that we all share. So think about it as like the anatomy of the psyche that everyone has, and the archetypes are part of that. And the archetype can be any kind of idea or figure or, let's say, pattern that is common across all human cultures and all eras. So I like to think about archetypes as these common skeletons of meaning that get fleshed out in different ways by different cultures in different eras, and then also different ways by us as individuals, but the same common form stays there. For example, we all have a king archetype or we all have a queen archetype, but we may understand those things slightly different, but the structure underlying it remains the same. And archetypes can show up in all sorts of different places. So for example, archetypes can show up in our dreams, and when we have an understanding of what these archetypes mean, it can help us understand what the dream is trying to communicate to us. And archetypes can show up also in myths and stories and fairy tales and other types of works of art as well. Now, another thing that's important to note about archetypes is that our relationship can be one that's integrated with that archetype, meaning that we're connecting with that archetype in a healthy way, but we can also have both a repressed and a possessive relationship with each given archetype. So sort of a repressed one is where we kind of push away all the elements of that particular archetype, and we are not able to access the positive qualities of that archetype. For example, if somebody has repressed their Puer Aeternus, they might not necessarily be able to go into, sort of imaginative dreamer mode and kind of think big about things. Or if someone has a more possessive form of that archetype, it might be about constantly getting caught up in the imagination and not being grounded at all and not being able to bring any goals to fruition. And so that possessive form of the archetype is actually where, again, it takes too much of a stronghold in our identity. And oftentimes we think about these archetypes as possessing us, but in actuality, it is us that holds on very, very tightly to a particular archetype. And in our over-identification with a particular archetype, that's when it starts to push away other qualities within ourselves and other potentials within ourselves that might compete with the dominance of that archetype. So in a nutshell, archetypes are common skeletons of meaning, and we can have an integrative relationship with that archetype, or we can have one where we repress that archetype, or one where that archetype possesses us. And oftentimes, if we have repressed that archetype, we can actually get sort of a backlash effect where that aspect actually unconsciously possesses us. So if we push an archetype away, it can also have a possessive sort of expression within ourselves as well. So what I'll be covering in today's video is a general description of the Puer first. Then we'll talk about the unhealthy versions of the Puer, the repressed and the possessive versions. Then we're going to talk about what it looks like when you integrate the Puer in a healthy way. And then we will talk about how to integrate the Puer with another archetype to prevent you from being a Puer yourself. All right, so now to describe the Puer Aeternus archetype, which again means eternal child. And the Puer Aeternus is basically very childlike in its imaginative qualities. And one of the things that the Puer has is the ability to think about ends without the means. So, for example, like in our adult minds, we tend to go into logistical thinking. It's like, okay, what's a realistic goal? And what like logistics and like what practical things do I have to do in order to make that goal happen? Whereas the Puer archetype really has to do with like coming up with big lofty goals without kind of any sense of logistics or limitation. So for example, if I want pet unicorns on Jupiter, that's sort of me tapping into the Puer Aeternus, because there's no way to make that goal happen, but I can want it as an end. And one of the things to note about the Puer Aeternus archetype is that it has initiation energy, the ability to come up with new ideas and to set a big vision. So with the Puer's initiatory energy, I like to think about it a bit like the spark wheel on a lighter. So the way that a lighter works is that you have all sorts of lighter fluid in the chamber, which is the medium that actually burns. But then in order to light it, you have to flick the spark wheel, and that creates this spark, this initiatory spark, and it lights the lighter fluid on fire. Now, one thing to note in this metaphor is that the Puer Aeternus is the spark wheel, but not the lighter fluid. And so if you just have the spark wheel, you're not actually going to be able to catch something aflame. And when someone has a possessive version of the Puer Aeternus archetype, it tends to be all sparks and no lighter fluid. But likewise, if all you have is lighter fluid and you have no spark wheel and nothing there to create that initial spark, then you're also not going to be able to produce a flame. So the Puer Aeternus is responsible for that initiatory spark, that sort of first imagination. So you have some kind of idea, and maybe the idea is realistic or maybe the idea isn't. But in coming up with that idea, it starts to help you understand what it is that you want, and to be able to operate from a sense of, I want to do this versus, oh, I have to do that. And so this is why it's really important to integrate the Puer Aeternus archetype, because it enables us to actually initiate ideas and make them happen in the world. And without the Puer, you can't really create those big lofty visions for yourself to move toward. And instead, life becomes this conveyor belt of tasks where it's just, oh, I have to do this, I have to do that. And we stay in this holding pattern. So the Puer Aeternus actually helps us move in the direction of progression. And when I think of the Puer Aeternus archetype, I always think about The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And in the story, it's basically the narrator is also the author. And the story is that he was flying around over the desert in like a one-man airplane and crash lands. And he meets inexplicably this like little boy who's just like there in the desert with no other people around. And it turns out that this boy actually comes from the stars, and he has his own planet, and he has all of these different imaginative ideas, and he tends to criticize grown-ups for their inability to think outside of the box. For example, the little prince asks the narrator to draw him a sheep, and with every sheep that the narrator draws him, he has some kind of issue with it, but then the narrator decides to draw a box with a couple of holes in it so that the sheep can breathe. And the little prince loves this interpretation of it and says, oh, I can see it, and look, he's in there, and the sheep has just fallen asleep just now. And so the little prince in this sense acts as a teacher of imagination for adults that have lost their sense of connection to that childlike joy and that way that children think. And with the Puer Aeternus archetype, it's very connected to personal sovereignty, as it helps you answer the question, what do I really want? And it helps you actually make decisions from the inside rather than from the outside. So if we're making decisions from the outside, we're thinking, what should I do? What do I have to do? What am I required to do? What are my obligations? What's going to work out here in reality? But really, when we're connected with the Puer Aeternus archetype, we're asking, what do I really want? And I like to think about the Puer as a nascent king who's fully operating off of what he wants and what his vision is. And he's very, very good at knowing how to answer that question of what do I really want? And it might be something way, way out there. It might be like, oh, I would love a pet unicorn. Or I would love to burrow down to the center of the earth. So it can be things that are way out there like that, but it's not coming from any sense of obligation from the outside, and it's more from the internal sense of what I call our truest, deepest will. And there's a popular book on masculine archetypes called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. And so I like to think about the Puer as being a little bit king, a little bit magician, and a little bit lover, but with no warrior. So the warrior is the one that does the legwork, that does the difficult things. Whereas it has the king in the sense that it's connected to sovereignty. It can answer the question, what do I really want? It's connected to the magician in the sense that there is something very magical about this archetype, even kind of maybe a bit of magical thinking going on. And it's very connected to the lover in the sense that the little prince that is the Puer Aeternus is very big on enjoyment and play and appreciation of sort of the simple things in life that just bring a lot of joy and delight. So it's like a nascent version of the king, magician, and lover, but without the warrior at all. And when we have integrated the Puer with the warrior, what we want is the Puer to come up with lots and lots and lots of different interesting ideas. And then the Puer has to hand over all of these ideas to the warrior, and the warrior will sacrifice and sort of kill off 99% of those ideas, leaving just the one, and then taking actionable steps to make that idea happen in reality. So we want to connect to the Puer and expand and dream and allow ourselves to be in this space of ideals, and then we want to pluck one of those ideas out, and we actually want to do the legwork to make those things happen. And that requires the integration of the warrior archetype. And when someone has a possessive relationship with the Puer archetype, the Puer refuses to hand over any of its creative ideas to the warrior. It just wants to sit there and to dream and to stay in this world of ideas and ideals, sitting with the rich inner world, but not making anything come to fruition as a reality. And this will turn us into a directionless dreamer with no power if we get caught up in this pattern, and the warrior isn't able to sort of give over its ideas to the warrior. And in this process of turning an idea into a reality and doing the sort of practical, logistical legwork to make that idea happen, it basically causes us to have to sort of interact with, sort of boring, mundane, 3D reality, which is something that when we have, let's say, a possessive relationship with the Puer archetype, it's difficult for us to abide. We'd rather stay in the interesting, idealistic inner world. And so again, just as a reminder, we want to integrate the Puer Aeternus archetype. So we have, let's say, when it's integrated, it's in its positive form. It helps us gain that initiatory spark, that initial idea. It's the thing that helps us sort of initiate out into the world as opposed to just responding to everything all the time and life being this like conveyor belt of like just practical tasks that we have to do. Like the Puer Aeternus is so important for that. But if we get too attached to the Puer Aeternus, then what happens is that we just kind of stay in the inner world and nothing ever really gets done. And so again, the Puer Aeternus archetype, there is nothing wrong with that archetype, but oftentimes because we call a person a Puer or a Puella when they're kind of stuck in that extended adolescence, we oftentimes will associate that archetype as kind of a negative archetype because we think about it in terms of the possessive form of that archetype. But there is an integrative form of that archetype. So our goal is to integrate and not to get rid of the Puer. So there's an excellent quote by Thomas Edison, and that quote is that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And in this, you want to think about the Puer Aeternus archetype as the 1% inspiration. It's not enough to make something actually happen. It's just the initiatory spark, that initial idea, but such an important 1% that it is. But 99% is all about the logistics, the practicality, and the amount of effort that we put in, which is in the realm of the warrior archetype. So I want you to keep this quote in mind as we talk about the two different unhealthy expressions of the Puer Aeternus archetype, and those are the repressed and the possessing version of the archetype. All right, so first we're going to talk about the unhealthy overactive form of the Puer Aeternus archetype, which is basically what it is when somebody's called a Puer or a Puella. It means that they have the overactive form or the possessive form of that archetype. And so you want to think about that in terms of that Edison quote as it's all inspiration and no perspiration. So this is the directionless dreamer with no power that's not taking the steps toward achieving any of their visions and goals. And one of the main issues with this relationship to this archetype is that it can't drown any of its darlings. So it wants to live in a world of infinite possibilities. And so like, let's say that somebody with an overactive, unhealthy version of the Puer archetype is in a room and they have to choose a path to go down, and maybe it's like there's 10 doors that they could walk through, and they want to keep the possibilities of just having all 10 doors. But what you really have to do is you have to choose one of those doors, and by choosing one, you're choosing not to go in the other 9 doors. And so that's very difficult for someone with a possessive relationship with the Puer Aeternus archetype, because the Puer Aeternus just wants doors and doors and doors and doors. It wants infinite possibilities, and it wants everything to come to fruition effortlessly. And so it's not able to sort of commit and devote itself to just one path. And unfortunately, what happens is that the adventure that the Puer Aeternus craves only ever happens then in the inner world. They don't actually end up having any external world adventures. And he can't commit himself to just one path and to really experience the value of devotion. And that's because he loves expansion and hates contraction, and yet contraction is necessary to bring something to fruition. So the Puer is all yang and no yin. So if we think about the way that an idea is brought to fruition, it starts up here in the imagination, and then as we choose something, we're cutting away possibilities and we're bringing it down into this imperfect 3D world. And so we're having to lose a lot of ideals and a lot of possibilities as we're sort of birthing something into reality. So we start very expansive, and then things contract down into something tangible, something that we can actually like exist in relation to in the real world. And someone with a possessive Puer has extreme difficulty doing that. And the Puer is always wanting everything to be interesting and fantastical and magical all the time. And it has a huge issue with actually being present in a boring circumstance and just tending to the conveyor belt of tasks that come up every day, just kind of doing our taxes, right? So it's like it can't abide those kind of more boring sort of activities. Also, with the possessive Puer, it hates ordinariness and averageness. It wants everything to be extra special. And because of this, there's a tendency toward maximization along a lot of different spectrums, but never really quite actually being able to move in that direction. So there's this concept called the maximizers and the satisficers. And it basically describes like purchasing behaviors of people with 2 different frames of mind. So the satisficer is somebody who, like, let's say they want to buy a new vacuum cleaner. It's like they're going to look at their options and then they're going to be like, yeah, this one's good enough. And they're going to be satisfied with that vacuum cleaner, and then they're going to go on about their business. A maximizer is one that keeps feeling like, oh, I need more and more options, or you just can't find the perfect vacuum cleaner. And when they do choose one, they're never satisfied. And so it's really difficult for a maximizer to actually just appreciate what it is that they have, because they're always trying to like level up and level up and level up and level up. This is very, very like common when there is a possessive relationship with the Puer archetype. And this doesn't just apply to buying vacuum cleaners. It has to do with career paths, relationships, lifestyles, all sorts of things that are like major life decisions. And so the satisficer in this sense just kind of like chooses a path of devotion and then sticks with that path of devotion. Someone with a possessive Puer archetype stays in that maximizer mentality where it's like, oh, this path's not good enough, this path's not good enough, this path's not good enough. And they keep waiting for a more and more and more ideal path to go down, relationship-wise, career-wise, etc. But the perfect path never comes along. And so they're always holding out for something better. And because of this, they don't get the positive experiences associated with devotion to one particular path, because they are very attached to what is ideal and what is perfect, and they're looking for the ideal and perfect path. And so they don't want to settle for an imperfect path. But in order to devote ourselves, we have to choose an imperfect path, and then that's where we really find the value in that. And when this happens, the person with the possessive Puer archetype, it just stagnates in life. It's like they're going around in circles. They never actually go anywhere because they don't choose a path of devotion to go down. And life basically stagnates from there. And in this case, it's like the richness all is within the inner world, which further cements the person in this possessive puer relationship inside of themselves, with difficulties sort of branching out into the dreary world where actually all the magic really does happen. This also leads to a lack of experience and a lack of maturity through experiencing. So somebody who keeps putting off relationship until they find the most perfect one doesn't get any relationship experience. Or a person who keeps putting off their, choosing a particular career path that's going to be really fulfilling for them is just going to have to kind of settle for like little menial jobs and things like that. And it's not going to be fulfilling for them. So it's basically like life just basically forces them into these positions that they would have otherwise been quite helpful to like actually use the Puer archetype to help them dream up something that they really want to be experiencing. But because of that difficulty with, let's say, sacrifice and also devotion, when someone has a possessive Puer archetype, they don't ever really end up getting those experiences. And without those experiences, they don't develop the maturity and they don't like come to know themselves in certain ways. All right, so that's the unhealthy, possessive, overactive form of the Puer. Now we'll talk about the unhealthy, underactive form of the Puer. And so going back to that Edison quote, it is all perspiration with no inspiration. And so this is all 100% warrior with no puer at all. So it's all just a bunch of like logistical work to make something happen, but it isn't actually the thing that you want to have happen. And so we want to think about it almost like a conveyor belt of tasks that you didn't choose coming at you that you just have to deal with. And so it's a lot like just treading water. And when I've worked with clients who have had sort of a difficulty connecting with their Puer Aeternus archetype, the way that it operates is that we only focus on the means and never the ends, where it's like, okay, I know that I have to do this and I have to do that and I should do that and I'm obligated to do this, but we never think, what do I want? And oh, here's the thing that I want off in the future and how do I take steps toward that? Instead, it's just that life throws tasks at us and then we have to kind of just tend to those tasks. And with this underactive and repressed form of the Puer archetype, it's like we have to grow up too fast. We have to just cut away our more childlike wonder and then we just have to stick it away somewhere. And this tends to be what causes this type of negative relationship with the Puer archetype. And with the repressed relationship to the Puer archetype, it oftentimes comes with this kind of like realistic, quote unquote, cynicism that isn't often actually very realistic, but it sort of is like, oh, why dream bigger? That's not going to happen anyway. Get your head out of the clouds. Or even a perspective like, well, you're not actually supposed to enjoy the work that you do. You just have to do it. Mind you, this would be really excellent advice for someone with an overactive, sort of possessive relationship with the Puer for sure. But in general, these are sort of overtly like overcorrections in the opposite direction, where we're trying to kind of almost like throw away the Puer entirely and to just totally dethrone it from its sort of center within the personality. And a person with the repressed Puer archetype might identify themselves as being a very hard worker and may even sort of appreciate the fact that they can just engage with dreariness and with the boredom of just going through the conveyor belt of daily tasks. But oftentimes there's just this overwhelm of it because the person isn't actually operating from a sense of sovereignty. They're not operating off of what do I want, because that requires the Puer to actually even answer the question, what do I want? Instead, they have to outsource their activities and their motivations because they can't dream up an idea themselves because they're not connected to the Puer archetype. And so what they have to do is they have to follow orders from other people and they have to rely on external sources of motivation to move them along. And oftentimes these sources of motivation are more in the negative, like, oh no, if I don't get this task done, this bad thing is going to happen. Or if I don't reach the deadline in time, then that bad thing is going to happen. And so to have a repressed relationship with the Puer archetype, it's like we have to almost keep whipping ourselves just to keep us like productive and moving forward with our goals. And it becomes really difficult to actually feel inspired to do the work. But like we can like basically drudge ourselves through that work. And so oftentimes when somebody has a repressed relationship with the Puer archetype, we can almost end up with a flip around where we end up somewhat in the possessive form of that archetype as well. So for example, if somebody is just dealing with the drudgery of things, all they want is to do nothing. It's like if somebody's there carrying a big heavy weight that they didn't choose to carry, all they want is for the weight to be lifted up off of them. And so what you can find is that this person, while being a logistical thinker, while being somebody who's like, yeah, you got to just get it done, sometimes you can end up in this sort of laziness pattern where it is kind of like the possessive form of the Puer archetype. And so it's kind of a horseshoe where it's like you go so far on this side that you end up on the other side. And so the person with the repressed relationship with the Puer can oftentimes end up shirking responsibilities because they have a repressed Puer. And the person with the repressed Puer can't think about ends at all. They can only think about means, whereas the person with the overactive Puer can only think about ends but not about means. And if you have a repressed relationship with your Puer archetype, life probably feels a bit like treading water, where you're not moving in the direction of something you actually do want, but you're just kind of trying to stay treading water in place so that you can avoid negative circumstances. And oftentimes this can even lead to addictive kind of behaviors where we're looking for some kind of release from that just tiring cycle of treading water without actually having progression toward anything that we really want to experience. So with the repressed Puer, there is no progression, there's only treading water and trying to maintain the status quo. All right, so those are the two unhealthy relationships with the Puer. Now let's talk about the healthy integrated relationship with the Puer archetype. So going back to that Edison quote, it is somebody who is capable of both inspiration and perspiration at once. It's somebody who can come up with many different possibilities of visions, choose one of those visions, and then set that as a North Star to follow, and then actually take the practical, boring, dreary, logistical steps to make that dream happen. And this type of person can be a real fire starter in the sense that they can come up with a vision and then they can invite other people into their vision. And it helps us integrate sort of that nascent king with the warrior archetype so that we can continually, work toward our goals and let's say constantly be moving in the direction toward what we really truly want, our truest, deepest will. And anyone who wants to be a leader in this world, anyone who wants to start anything, start a movement, has got to integrate both the Puer Aeternus and the warrior together. Now I'm going to share with you my experiences of what it's been like to integrate the Puer Aeternus archetype with the warrior. So one of the things that I've always been blessed with is, sort of a rich inner world. And so I've always been very connected to the Puer Aeternus archetype. I've always gravitated toward more creative things. I've always been, interested in dreams and imagination. It's just always been like a huge passion of mine. And certainly there have been times where I've been more in the unhealthy version of the Puer Aeternus archetype, where maybe I've succumbed in certain situations to maladaptive daydreaming and this sort of thing. But one of the things that was really helpful when I was 16 years old is that that's when I started to really integrate the warrior. And it was during a time where I had just gotten my first job. I used to work at KFC when I was 16. And then I also had my schoolwork, which my schoolwork had just gotten a lot more challenging. And it was in this time frame when you're really starting to think about the future and what are you going to do. And I was going to go to college. And so I was like, okay, I got to make sure that I have good grades. And so basically my schedule at the time was crazy hectic. I would wake up at 5 something in the morning. I was the first stop on the bus. And so I had to get on the bus really early and then ride to school. I'd go through school. I'd walk to work. I'd have about an hour in between, when I'd clock into work, and then I would get home probably usually around 10 to 11 o'clock, from work. And then I would have 2 to 3 hours of homework, if not more, to do. And so I would be staying up into the wee hours of the morning, 2 a.m. And then I'd have to get back up at 5:30 a.m. and do it all over again. And so it was a really, really difficult time where I didn't get a lot of rest and I had to do a lot of work. But I was very, very lucky to have a teacher that was very well integrated with the warrior archetype. And he would say things like, successful people do things well, especially when they don't want to. And also this idea of making excellence into a habit. And so these are ideas that are very connected to the warrior archetype. And it's just sort of like being willing to sacrifice and being willing to like move forward and like sort of get things done. And so this was something that really served me quite well, because I'd also started to get into art. Like those were the main like focuses. And so I decided at that point that I wanted to be an art teacher. And that is something that I did end up eventually making happen before I started my channel. And so basically it was integrating the warrior with sort of that vision. You know, it was kind of like I could think about the future and be like, okay, I want to make this thing happen. And then I started to be able to actually take the steps, the necessary legwork, you know, the necessary work to make these dreams happen. And so that was what it was for me when my Puer Aeternus, which had always been, you know, an active force in my life, got connected together with that warrior archetype, where I could set a vision for myself, and then I could be the one that actually follows the steps toward that vision. Now, when it comes to blocks to integrating with the Puer, with the warrior, so the warrior, it's the warrior can sacrifice and devote itself, and it can deal with all manner of drudgery. Whereas the overactive Puer can't do that, where it's like, oh, I want everything to be interesting. I want everything to be immediate. I want everything to be effortless. And so there's basically like, if somebody has a really romantic idea of like effortless action, or like, oh, I want to be immediately good at this thing, or, you know, that values innate talent over hard work, those can all be impediments to actually integrating the warrior with the Puer Aeternus and actually giving the ideas of the Puer Aeternus wheels to actually like be able to move forward with those goals. Now with the underactive Puer, this is sort of like where we're all warrior and, you know, no Puer archetype. And so oftentimes it's like, this is because a person has really like sort of pushed away the inner dreamer, maybe thinks about like, it's like, oh, why are you thinking about childish, silly things? You shouldn't be so focused on childish, silly things. Or, oh, why does this matter to you? You should just like, you know, work like everyone else does. And like, you know, basically it's like this sense of come get your head out of the clouds, you dreamer, and just be a little bit more down to earth. And with the person that has blocks to integrating the Puer, it's the person who's like really swept up in thinking about means all the time and logistical thinking, and they don't actually have any clear vision for the future. They don't necessarily think that life can be some other way than it is now. And so what you have to do is you have to just kind of like keep things going, you know, keep the wheels turning, you know, keep everything tended to, engage in all of the cyclical tasks, you know, be Sisyphus, roll the boulder up the hill, just knowing that it's going to roll back down. There's no place that you're going to get to. There can also be mindsets like, who am I to want better than this? There's also an undervaluing of process-oriented motivation and things like being motivated towards something just because it's fun to do it. There always has to be some other important outcome to go to other than just, oh, I want to feel good in this, or I want to have fun, or oh, this excites me, or I feel curiosity in this sense. And because of this aversion to process-oriented motivation, ultimately our process-oriented motivation is what shows us what it is that we really want. It's sort of like, how do we want to be living our life? What kind of activities do we really want to be engaged in? It's really about how we feel when we're engaged in the process of doing something. And so when it's the case that we get disconnected from this, then it's the case that we can't even come up with a vision of what we want. We don't really know how to answer the question, what do I want? And all of these things block a person from integrating with the Puer Aeternus with their warrior archetype. Now for this last segment of the video, we're going to be talking about how to integrate the warrior with the Puer. So first we're going to talk about how to integrate the warrior with the Puer for people who could be described as Puers or Puellas or have a more overactive relationship with this archetype. So the first thing that you can do if you want to integrate the warrior with the Puer is to recognize the value of everydayness, ordinariness, and the mundane. You'll also want to become disenchanted with effortless success and really start valuing hard work. Like, so for example, when I was 16 years old and I first started to integrate the warrior archetype, to me, it was like, I felt like I was like doing battle, and it was like the more I struggled, the more that like the success actually meant to me. I actually had totally devalued sort of anything effortless at that point in time, and it was like, look at how hard I'm working. So you want to in some ways like sort of embrace and even potentially romanticize some degree of struggle, and to recognize that if you work hard for something, that it's almost like it's more important the process of working hard toward it and getting, sort of the wisdom of actually having to struggle through something, as opposed to choosing something that's already the path of least resistance for you and being able to be successful in that. Now, there's a lot to be said about that too. We also don't want to lose sight of that, because we want to stay aligned to what it is that what actually comes naturally to us. And so there's also a wisdom to finding what is effortless to us. But when it comes to integrating the warrior with the puer, and to be able to offset that sort of like polarization into the puer archetype, we want to really start to romanticize struggle and, almost like kind of thinking about it as like, I can endure the drudgery of this, or I can do things well even when I don't want to. You'll also want to develop the obstacle is the path mindset. Oftentimes when a person isn't yet integrated with their warrior, they'll come up against an obstacle and they'll think, oh, that's a sign that I shouldn't go further here. Everything should be going easily. If it's not going easily, it means it's not in alignment. And that just isn't true. You will run into tons and tons and tons of obstacles in the pursuit of your goal. And that is just the nature of any path that's actually worthwhile. You're always going to run into contrast. You also want to drown your darlings. So this is often a phrase that's used like sort of in writers' circles, where it's sort of like you might have, let's say somebody's writing a novel and they have all these ideas that they want to put in the novel, and then they find that, these like wonderful ideas, some of them just don't fit in and they have to start subtracting them. And so this is the idea of drown your darlings, is that you have to cut away at all of the ideas and all of the possibilities, and you have to edit things down. The same thing of like sort of the metaphor with all of the doors, and you have to choose one door and then you have to drown the rest of them. So basically it's like you're deliberately sort of taking the sword and hacking away at 99% of possibilities to leave the 1% over. You will also want to develop your capacity for devotion and commitment. Somebody who is disintegrated with the warrior and too much into the Puer Aeternus has a lot of difficulty actually devoting themselves to a particular path, because they're always looking to expand their possibilities in a very breadthy way, and are always looking for a more and more ideal option. And this idea that once the ideal partner comes up, or once the ideal career path, or once the ideal life path comes up, that they'll take it. And so basically a person would need to be able to devote themselves to an imperfect path. And so developing sort of the ability for devotion, and to be able to recognize that in the devotion towards something, that's really where you get the real meaning and value from things. It's not from being on a perfect path, but it's through the process of committing yourself and devoting yourself to an imperfect path. And so in this way, it is actually quite wise to put all of your eggs in one basket, because you want to not spread your energy out through all of these different possibilities, but you want to really go, into something very, very deeply if you want this like positive relationship between the Puer and the warrior. You will also want to accept your mortality and understand that you will one day die. So basically there was an old, let's say, pattern that painters used to do, where they would paint a skull on the painting, and it would be called the memento mori, which means remember you will die. And this is something that's really important to keep in mind, is that you don't have an infinite amount of time here. You can't expand infinitely here. You have to find paths of contraction to actually live. So you have to go from like looking for possibilities to actually choosing one of those possibilities and devoting yourself to that path. And so keeping in mind that time doesn't stretch on forever and ever, and you are on a time clock, is very, very helpful for sort of like getting you to make those decisions. And even just the fact that like you will one day die can give you a sense of like clarity around, okay, what do I really want to spend my time doing? Do I want to spend my time in the waiting room, my life in the waiting room, just kind of waiting for the perfect path to come along? Or do I want to have a lot of imperfect but really meaningful adventures to devote myself to? Now, another thing that you want to come to understand is the insight that everything in Plato's world of the forms absolutely sucks. Anything that is ideal is usually lacking in substance, lacking in meaning, and it's really in the imperfections and the ordinariness of things that you actually find that which is sublime and that which is interesting. So if we think about like the difference between, let's say, a mannequin and a real person, we can kind of see that distinction between that which is like sort of ideal versus that which is real. And the real is always imperfect and is always ordinary, and that's where you will find the beauty in things. Also, allow yourself to contract and be limited. So when it comes to embracing mortality, that's of course one form of it, but to really appreciate that which is temporal, that which doesn't last forever. So for example, a flower blooms for a short time and is very beautiful when it blooms, but there's also a beauty in the fact that the flower withers, and a real flower is so much more beautiful than one that you're actually going to just like buy at a craft store, like a fake flower, because that one doesn't have that same cycle of having a peak and then a trough afterward. And the final piece of advice I have to integrate the warrior with the Puer Aeternus is to allow reality to humble you. So with an overactive Puer, the Puer has all kinds of ideas and ideals. And it's when the rubber meets the road and reality comes at you and you realize that, oh, things aren't exactly as I thought they were, or oh wow, look, I'm way in over my head, or this is like too much for me, or anything like this where it's like we expect for things to be perfect or ideal, or we expect ourselves to be perfect or ideal, or maybe we even have an identity of being ideal in some way. And then it's like reality just sort of cracks that illusion, and then we end up actually experiencing the real thing, and we end up experiencing our vulnerabilities in that. And so understanding that when we take something from an idea and we actually like bring it to fruition and we actually go through our life, we actually experience a great humbling where it's like, oh, I don't have an infinite amount of time, and I don't have an infinite amount of power, and I don't have an infinite amount of skill to make these things happen. I have to choose an imperfect path and to realize that imperfect path imperfectly. So these are the things that you would need to do in order to integrate the warrior with the Puer Aeternus archetype. And also sacrifice is a huge thing that comes into play with this as well. Again, it's sacrificing the perfect for the imperfect. You are not Superman, and this is not the ideal world. All right, so that is how you integrate the warrior with the Puer archetype in order to sort of depolarize and to get out of sort of Puer or Puella mode, so that you can actually have that spark of inspiration, but you can also bring things to fruition, and that you're able to kind of find the richness of the inner world in the external world. Now we'll go into how to integrate the Puer itself if you're somebody who has a repressed relationship with the Puer and you feel disconnected from your inner child. So the very first thing you want to do is you want to look for any mindsets that you have that might block the Puer from, let's say, being embraced. So for example, if you have an idea that, oh, if I focus on frivolous things, that means I'm a silly, unserious person that shouldn't be taken seriously. Or maybe you have like strong judgments toward people who with their head in the clouds. It's like, oh yeah, these artsy types, like it's like they don't understand how the real world works. If you have any kind of things like that, you want to take note of that. Or if you just have an aversion to people with their head in the clouds a bit. Also, if you have this idea that work is supposed to be something that's unenjoyable, so why would I try to imagine better for work? Yeah, so I recommend if you notice yourself engaging in any of those judgments or having any even subtle aversions toward, let's say people being more in that dreamer mode, or having a more dreamy outlook on life, then I recommend writing that down and kind of like thinking about all the different reasons why those blocks exist there in the first place. Commonly, when somebody has a resistance to the Puer archetype, it can be about like having to be made to grow up too quickly, or to be in a place where we had to be responsible very young, and so we didn't get a chance to actually develop a relationship with that childlike part of ourselves because we had to start focusing on adult responsibilities really early. And so to get back in touch with the Puer Aeternus, what you want to do is you want to really truly allow yourself to dream. Ask yourself, what do I really want? And allow yourself to get as fantastical with it as possible. So I sometimes have my clients do an exercise that I call Awakening the Dreamer. And the idea is that you're in this alternate reality. Your current reality is totally on pause, so nothing bad's going to happen. In your present reality, you're not going to lose anything. And you also have a magic wand, and you have all the money in the bank. So you can think about only means, and you don't have to think about logistics at all, because anything that you want is there at the snap of your fingers in this exercise. And so basically I recommend, being fantastical. So if you want pet unicorns on Jupiter, it's pet unicorns on Jupiter. If you want to be the king of the world, you can be the king of the world. If you, want to have an adventure where you jump from dream to dream to dream, either one. Any of these will help you get more in touch with the Puer archetype, and will also help you understand more about what makes you tick. Oftentimes, because just adult reality requires us to be so logistics focused and always focused on the means to an end, we end up getting sort of like boxed in our imagination, where we don't necessarily think about, oh, where do I really want to go? Instead, we end up sort of treading water in place, and we don't necessarily think like, okay, if I didn't have to think about logistics at all, what is it that I would really want? You'll also want to embrace and find meaning in fun and in the arts. Things that, let's say, don't have some kind of utilitarian purpose. Not as to say, some art has a utilitarian purpose, but more so like just in the enjoyment of making the art, or in the enjoyment of taking in the art. That's what you really want to connect to, is that process-based motivation. So it's like, oh, I really enjoy doing this, or I really enjoy doing that. Adulthood, we oftentimes get mired in sort of product motivation, where it's like, okay, I need to get to this outcome. Okay, I have to finish this by this deadline, or I need to make this happen. But instead, when we're connecting with the dreamer, we want to think about, oh, how do we want to exist in the world? What processes do I want to be in? What ways do I want to feel while I'm engaged in this process? It's like, and if I think about, oh, I really want to feel wonder all of the time, it'd be great to experience wonder every day. So it's like, what kind of processes could I engage in to experience wonder? So it's like, maybe I experience wonder when I do sort of looking into my dreams, and that feels like I'm engaging in this mysterious, wondrous thing, or maybe stargazing. And so it's being able to think about things in terms of what's the experience you want to be having right now, as opposed to, here, I need to get to this outcome over here. So again, focusing on ends and not means themselves. And oftentimes when people dream, they'll oftentimes pick something that has to do with means as well. It's like, okay, I want $1 million. And I'm like, okay, well, $1 million is just a means to another end. Really, the question is, what are you going to use that $1 million for? And sort of similar to what I had said earlier, is you want to focus on the question of how do I want to feel, and then you reverse engineer that thing. So like I had mentioned with the wonder, it's like, okay, if I know I want to feel wonder, it's like I know that I want to be engaged in dream work, or I know that I want to be engaged in the process of stargazing. So these are things that you can do to integrate the Puer if you have a repressed relationship with it. All right, so that's all about the Puer archetype. So again, we talked about the general archetype, what the unhealthy sort of overactive and underactive versions of it are, and also what are the main blocks that you might experience to one or the other, either the warrior or the Puer archetype. And then we talked at the end about how to integrate the Puer and the warrior archetype. All right, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, give me a like down below and comment down below. also, if you would like to use shadow work to help you achieve your goals and dreams and to even awaken the dreamer a bit, I actually have a group coaching program that's designed specifically to help you learn how to use shadow work in order to integrate the dreamer and also to integrate the warrior and also to remove any kind of other obstacles that sort of are there to you actually moving in the direction of your truest, deepest will and what it is that you really want. And so if that seems like something that you think you might be interested, go ahead and click the link down below in my description box to either learn more or schedule a discovery call. And if you would like to learn more about the inner world, go ahead and click this video right here. And until next time, keep becoming more you.